At 07:42 a.m., August 15th, 1942, over the Milne Bay sector of New Guinea, the sky mixed ash and blue. The buzz of Rolls-Royce Merlin engines filled the cockpit, vibrating through the aluminum frame of the Hawker Hurricane Mark II-B. The sun fought to rise over the jungle canopy below, casting jagged shadows across broken earth. In the chaos of the Pacific Air War, Squadron Leader Robert Franklin's grip tightened on the control column. His radio crackled. "Bandits inbound, 11 o'clock high," a voice reported. A flight of Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighters, faster, more agile, longer ranged. The Hurricane, transferred from North African stocks, was heavier, less maneuverable, and carried a reputation for being outmatched in this theatre. But it was all the Commonwealth squadrons had. Franklin checked his instruments. Oil pressure steady, fuel sufficient. He listened as his ground crew chief's voice came through static. "She's built tough, sir. She'll bring you home." Franklin swallowed. The engagement had begun, but his mind fixed on one harsh truth. In the Pacific, the Hurricane's reputation was the worst among Allied fighters. Today, it was all they had. It was March 1941, and Royal Air Force pilots, fresh from training schools in Rhodesia and Canada, filed into the dispersal huts at RAF Mingaladon, outside Rangoon. They were adjusting to the humid weight of Southeast Asian air and the unfamiliar silhouette of the Hawker Hurricane Mark II. Despite being the backbone of Britain's air defence over Europe, the Hurricane had always been overshadowed by the sleeker Supermarine Spitfire in public imagination. In Burma, it carried an additional burden. Reports from Singapore suggested it was too slow for the Pacific theatre. Flying Officer Stanley Granger, a former automobile mechanic from Manchester, stood in the maintenance hangar, hands blackened with grease. His job was not glamorous. It was methodical, repetitive work, checking magnetos, adjusting carburetors, ensuring the 12-cylinder Merlin XX engine was primed for the humid tropics. The Hurricane's fabric-covered rear fuselage required constant inspection for mold and tearing in the monsoon climate. "The Hurricane's got limitations," Stan muttered to his assistant, tightening a cowling panel with a wrench. "But I trust her structure." Across the flight line, Pilot Officer Jack Tanner struggled with his parachute harness inside the cramped cockpit. "This damned rig," he grunted, adjusting the straps. Stan approached, offering a hand. "She's got her quirks, but you show her respect, she'll show you the same." Tanner looked at the wing's leading edge, where stress fractures from heavy landings were visible, scars of a machine adapting to conditions it was never designed for. Fabric patches covered bullet holes from the previous week's strafing run on the airfield. As the sun set behind the Irrawaddy Delta, the pilots gathered near the operations tent, smoking Capstan cigarettes and joking. They couldn't help but compare the Hurricane unfavorably to the American P-40 Warhawks stationed at the far end of the field, newer, faster, more glamorous machines. But for all the mockery, the Hurricanes flew. They took off each dawn, engines coughing blue smoke, doing their duty against an enemy whose capabilities were still being measured in blood and wreckage. At 07:25 a.m., December 23, 1941, over the Moulmein sector of southern Burma, the sky vibrated with the low throb of hurricane engines. Above them, Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers formed neat formations, heading toward the port facilities. It was the Hurricane Squadron's task to intercept them before they reached the docks. Jack Tanner's heart pounded as he adjusted his oxygen mask. This was his fourth combat sortie since the Japanese invasion began 3 weeks prior, but the first time he'd engaged enemy fighters. He glanced at the instrument panel. The Hurricane Mark II felt sluggish at altitude, its weight evident in every control input. Behind him, Flight Lieutenant Edward Marks, an experienced pilot with kills over France in 1940, led the formation. He keyed his radio. "Stay in pairs and don't chase stragglers into the valleys." The first explosions fractured the calm as Japanese bombers released their loads prematurely, spotting the approaching hurricanes. Tanner tightened his grip. Then the escorts appeared. Ki-43, Oscar fighters, lighter and more agile than intelligence reports had suggested. One hurricane to Tanner's left began trailing white smoke, its glycol coolant system punctured. The pilot nosed down toward the river, but the aircraft never pulled out. The loss rate among Commonwealth squadrons in Burma was climbing. Official reports would later show 37 aircraft lost in the first month of operations, against fewer than 60 available. In his cockpit, Tanner heard the radio chatter intensify. "Fighters breaking right," someone called, voice tight. Tanner made his decision. He banked hard, the Hurricane's sturdy frame groaning under the G-forces. An Oscar flashed past, its pilot misjudging the Hurricane's turn radius. Tanner's confidence wavered as tracers arced over his canopy, but he pushed forward. He wasn't here to win. He was here to survive long enough to matter. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. 3 Hurricanes returned to Mingaladon with battle damage. One did not return at all. At the repair hangar in Mingaladon, Stan returned to his station at 14:30 hours, hands moving with practiced efficiency. The Hurricanes came back smoking, fabric torn, coolant lines severed. The damage was worse than the previous week. One fighter had its tailplane shredded by cannon fire. Another showed stress cracks along the main spar. Stan examined the wreckage, an idea forming. He remembered a modification memo from the Middle East theatre, a field adjustment to the propeller pitch control that could improve climb rate by reducing drag during combat power. Settings. The change was unauthorized, but the official supply chain was breaking down as Japanese forces pushed north. "Time to improvise," Stan muttered. He pulled tools from his kit, working quickly against the backdrop of air raid sirens, testing their circuits and the distant rumble of artillery from the Salween front. His pulse quickened. If the modification failed during flight, the propeller governor could overspeed and tear the engine apart. Meanwhile, Tanner sat on an ammunition crate outside the dispersal hut, watching the repair crews work. He felt the weight of being outnumbered and outperformed. But in the humid silence between alert scrambles, he began believing in something beyond aircraft specifications, in Stan's competence, in the Hurricane's brutal, stubborn refusal to disintegrate under punishment. A letter from his squadron commander, later archived in Air Ministry files, noted, "The Hurricane is proving surprisingly durable under conditions of rough field operation and battle damage. Serviceability rates exceed expectations." As the squadron launched the next morning at 6:50, the propeller modifications held. The Hurricanes climbed faster, reached altitude with less fuel consumed, and for the first time, pilots reported they could maintain formation with less throttle adjustment. It was a marginal gain, measured in seconds and feet, but in aerial combat, margins determined survival. Tanner felt the difference immediately. The Hurricane still wasn't fast, but it was more responsive. It gave him options. In the Arakan region of western Burma, January 1942, Tanner and his squadron engaged Japanese fighters again. The monsoon had broken temporarily, leaving the sky clear and unforgiving. Temperatures in the cockpit climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat soaked through flight suits. Tanner tightened his grip as he spotted the distinctive profile of Zero fighters, sleeker and faster than the Oscars they'd faced before. This time, the Hurricane performed better at lower altitudes where its robust construction and heavy armament mattered more than top speed. As the formation weaved through scattered clouds, Tanner's Hurricane shuddered. A thin stream of smoke trailed from the engine cowling. A minor oil leak, likely from a cracked gasket. "Damn it," Tanner whispered, but Stan's field modifications held. The engine continued running, its Merlin growl unchanged. Tanner pushed through, angling toward an enemy formation. A Zero closed fast, its pilot confident. But Tanner used the Hurricane's tighter turning radius, pulling hard left. The Zero overshot, unable to match the turn. Tanner didn't fire. His angle was wrong, but he survived the pass. The Hurricane, with its thick wings and sturdy frame, absorbed punishment that would have shredded lighter aircraft. Records from No. 17 Squadron later showed that Hurricanes, despite being slower, achieved a favorable exchange ratio when pilots exploited the aircraft's strengths, durability, firepower, and low-speed handling. One pilot's report noted, "The Hurricane can take hits that would down a Zero. If you survive the first pass, you have a chance." Tanner broke away from the engagement, nursing his damaged engine back to base. He landed at 0914, the Hurricane's tires smoking on the metal-planked runway. Ground crew counted 18 bullet holes in the fuselage. Not one had penetrated the armored seat or fuel tanks. For the first time, Tanner felt something beyond fear. The machine was working with him, not against him. Days of continuous operations began eroding the squadron. Fatigue settled into Tanner's bones, and even Stan, once energetic, moved with the weariness of too many 16-hour shifts under monsoon rains and engine roar. It was February 7, 1942 at 07:15 hours, and intelligence reports indicated a major Japanese push toward Rangoon. With only 11 serviceable Hurricanes remaining from the original squadron strength of 16, they prepared for what might be their final defense of the airfield. But circumstances were shifting. Reinforcements arrived, not aircraft, but experienced pilots evacuated from Malaya and Singapore, men who had fought Zeros and lived. They brought tactical knowledge, never dogfight a Zero, use diving attacks, exploit the Hurricane's superior dive speed and structural strength. As the squadron briefed, Flight Lieutenant Marks outlined the new approach. "We go in fast, hit hard and break away. No circling, no chasing. The Hurricane's built like a tank, use that." Tanner absorbed the new doctrine. It matched what he'd learned through survival. The Hurricane wasn't a dancer. It was a brawler. That afternoon they engaged a large formation of Japanese bombers escorted by Zeros. Tanner dove from 12,000 feet, building speed until the Hurricane's controls stiffened. He opened fire at 300 yards, walked his tracers into a bomber's fuselage, then pulled away before the escorts could react. The Hurricane shook violently during the pullout, but the wings held. Tanner climbed back to altitude, breathing hard. He'd made his first confirmed kill, a bomber spinning into the jungle below, trailing smoke. By evening, the tally showed 6 Japanese aircraft destroyed against 2 Hurricanes lost. It was the best exchange rate the squadron had achieved since December. Stan stood by the runway as aircraft returned, watching mechanics swarm over battle-damaged Hurricanes. They had survived, but everyone knew Rangoon was doomed. The question was how long they could keep flying before the inevitable retreat. As February progressed, the situation deteriorated. Japanese forces closed on Rangoon, and on March 7, 1942, the decision came to evacuate. Hurricane squadrons flew their last sorties from Mingaladon, then destroyed what they couldn't take and retreated north toward Magway and Akyab. Tanner was called to the operations tent where maps covered a folding table. The Hurricane's performance during the Burma campaign had been analysed by headquarters staff. Despite initial skepticism, the aircraft had proven surprisingly effective when properly employed. Squadron records showed that Hurricanes, flown by pilots who understood their limitations, achieved respectable results. They couldn't outrun Zeros, but they could outdive them. They couldn't outmaneuver Oscars, but they could absorb more damage and maintain formation integrity. A signal from Air Command Southeast Asia, declassified decades later, noted, "Hurricane operations demonstrate that tactical adaptation can offset technical disadvantages. Aircraft durability and firepower remain relevant factors." Stan stood beside his Hurricane at the dispersal area, fuel stains darkening his coveralls. The aircraft was no longer just a collection of parts requiring maintenance. It represented something more difficult to quantify. Resilience built by hands like his, through improvisation and relentless work. The next day, March 21st, the squadron launched from their new base at Magwe. They led an attack against Japanese forces consolidating around Prome. The Zeros were still faster, but the Hurricane pilots had learned. They fought in coordinated pairs, using altitude and dive attacks. They avoided prolonged engagements. Tanner led his section through clouds, spotted enemy fighters below, and Dove. His Hurricane accelerated smoothly, the modified propeller pitch allowing better speed control. He fired a burst, saw strikes on a Zero's wing, then pulled away before the formation could respond. The tide hadn't turned. Burma was being lost, but the Hurricane squadrons were no longer simply absorbing punishment. They were inflicting it. By month's end, the squadron would be forced to evacuate to India, but they carried with them hard-won lessons about how to make an obsolete fighter relevant through skill and adaptation. In April 1942, the Hurricane squadrons regrouped in eastern India at airfields in Assam and Bengal. The retreat from Burma was complete, but operations continued along the border. Pilots and ground crews, exhausted from months of combat and evacuation, began receiving upgraded Hurricane Mark II C models equipped with 4 20mm cannons instead of machine guns. The increased firepower changed the tactical equation. A single burst from a Hurricane 2TC could devastate enemy aircraft, compensating for the brief firing opportunities available during high-speed attacks. Tanner flew his first sortie in the new variant on April 18th. The weight of the cannons made the Hurricane even less maneuverable, but the destructive potential was immediately apparent. During an engagement over the Chindwin River Valley, he fired a 2-second burst into a Japanese bomber. The aircraft disintegrated, pieces tumbling into the jungle canopy. "Cannons make the difference," he reported after landing. "If you can hit them, you can kill them." Ground crews worked under bamboo shelters as monsoon rains began. Stan and his team adapted maintenance procedures to the new armament, dealing with cannon feed mechanisms that jammed in humid conditions. They improvised protective covers, cleaned breaches obsessively, and kept detailed logs of malfunctions. A technical report from No. 17 Squadron, dated May 1942, noted, "Hurricane 2TC serviceability affected by moisture infiltration in cannon mechanisms. Field modifications include sealed covers and daily cleaning protocols." The learning curve was steep, but the Hurricane was proving adaptable. Pilots who had mocked the aircraft 6 months earlier now spoke of it with something resembling respect. It wasn't the best fighter, no one claimed that, but it was good enough. And in the desperate circumstances of 1942, good enough meant survival. By late May, Allied intelligence reports indicated that Japanese air superiority was no longer absolute. Hurricane squadrons operating from dispersed jungle airstrips were contesting the skies over Burma's border regions. The psychological impact mattered as much as the tactical results. The hurricane had become a symbol of persistence under impossible conditions. The Zeros dove with extraordinary speed and precision, their pilots confident after months of dominating Pacific skies. But the hurricane pilots had learned. They no longer tried to match Japanese maneuverability. Instead, they used altitude, teamwork, and the hurricane's structural strength. Tanner led his section through a coordinated attack on June 12, 1942, over the Caladan Valley. They positioned themselves above a Japanese formation, then dove in pairs, alternating attacks to prevent enemy fighters from establishing pursuit. Tanner's cannons hammered, the recoil shaking the Hurricane's airframe. A Zero attempted to follow him through a dive, but the Hurricane's superior dive speed, a product of its robust construction and heavier weight, allowed Tanner to extend away. The Zero pilot pulled up, unable or unwilling to risk structural failure at high speed. Behind Tanner, his wingman engaged a second Zero that had attempted to cut off the escape route. The coordinated tactics were working. The Hurricanes weren't winning through superiority. They were winning through disciplined execution of a sound defensive strategy. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. 2 Japanese aircraft were confirmed destroyed, with a third claimed as probably destroyed. No Hurricanes were lost. Tanner returned to base at 11:43, his Hurricane's engine temperature elevated but within limits. He climbed from the cockpit, legs shaking from adrenaline and sustained G-forces. Stan met him on the hard stand, examining the aircraft for damage. "Clean," Stan reported. "No hits." Tanner nodded, too exhausted to speak. A week later, a summary report from Air Headquarters India noted that Hurricane squadrons were achieving parity with Japanese fighters in specific tactical situations. The report acknowledged that while the Hurricane remained inferior in speed and climb rate, proper employment negated many of these disadvantages. The shift was subtle but measurable. Loss rates had stabilized. Morale was improving. The Hurricane, once considered a liability in the Pacific theater, was becoming a viable weapon system. The aircraft hadn't changed, the pilots and tactics had. By August 1942, Hurricane operations had expanded. Commonwealth squadrons now operated across India's eastern frontier, providing air defense for bases and supporting ground operations. The aircraft that had been dismissed as obsolete in late 1941 was now integral to Allied defensive planning. Tanner's squadron relocated to an advanced airstrip at Chittagong, where they faced renewed Japanese air activity. Intelligence reports indicated enemy bombers were targeting port facilities and supply depots, crucial to the Allied build-up for future offensives. On August 15th, at the exact moment squadron leader Robert Franklin led his flight over Milne Bay in New Guinea, where Hurricanes also operated in limited numbers, Tanner's squadron engaged a large Japanese raid over Chittagong. The tactics were now standardized. Hurricanes attacked in coordinated pairs, exploiting altitude advantage, using dive attacks, and avoiding prolonged turning engagements. Radio discipline was strict. Ammunition was conserved for high probability shots. Tanner positioned his section at 18,000 feet, waiting as the enemy formation approached below. His breathing was steady, his scan methodical. He'd flown 73 combat sorties since December. He'd survived by learning the Hurricane's language, understanding what the aircraft could and couldn't do. "Tally," his wingman called. "Bombers at 10 o'clock low." Tanner acknowledged, rolled inverted, and pulled through into a diving attack. The Hurricane accelerated cleanly, the modified propeller settings from Stan's earlier work still providing marginal advantages. Tanner centered his gun sight on a bomber's fuselage, waited until range closed to 200 yards, then fired. 4 20mm cannons converged their fire. The bomber shuddered, pieces separating from its airframe, then rolled and began a slow spiral toward the Bay of Bengal below. Tanner pulled away, climbing back to altitude. The engagement continued around him, but his part was complete. He'd made the attack, achieved the kill, and survived. The hurricane had given him the tools, durability, firepower, predictable handling. He'd provided the skill and discipline. By day's end, the squadron claimed 5 enemy aircraft destroyed. 2 hurricanes returned with damage. None were lost. The air war over Burma and eastern India continued through the monsoon season of 1942. Hurricane squadrons adapted to operating from primitive airstrips, often little more than cleared fields with rudimentary drainage. Serviceability rates, which had been a concern in early operations, stabilized as ground crews, mastered field maintenance procedures. Stan's team worked under canvas shelters, often by torchlight, keeping the hurricanes operational despite mud, humidity, and supply shortages. They fabricated replacement parts from salvaged materials, improvised solutions to chronic problems, and maintained detailed logs that would later inform official maintenance protocols. A logistics report from Air Headquarters India, dated October 1942, acknowledged, "Hurricane ground crews have demonstrated exceptional resourcefulness in maintaining operational readiness under austere conditions. Field modification procedures now incorporated into official technical orders." Tanner and his fellow pilots returned from sorties to find their aircraft ready again within hours, sometimes minutes. The reliability wasn't just about the hurricane's design, it was about the people who maintained them. But the cost was accumulating. Pilots who had started the campaign in December 1941 were exhausted. Ground crews worked without adequate rest. Equipment was wearing out faster than it could be replaced. On November 3rd, Tanner's squadron was pulled from frontline duty for rest and refit. They relocated to a rear area base near Calcutta, where replacement hurricanes and personnel arrived. The squadron had lost 9 pilots killed or missing since the campaign began, with 14 wounded or evacuated for medical reasons. Tanner sat in the officers' mess, staring at a glass of weak tea. He thought about the faces no longer present, pilots who had died in hurricanes that had fought as well as they could, but couldn't overcome circumstances. A letter to his family, archived in the Imperial War Museum, included one line: "The Hurricane isn't a brilliant machine, but it's a faithful one. It brings you home when it can." By December, the squadron was operational again, flying newer Hurricane Mark II models and preparing for renewed offensive operations. The year 1943 brought changes. Allied air power in Southeast Asia was growing. New aircraft types, Spitfires, P-38 Lightnings, Beaufighters, arrived in increasing numbers. The Hurricane's role began shifting from frontline fighter to fighter bomber and close air support. Tanner's squadron transitioned to ground attack missions, their Hurricanes now carrying bombs and rockets in addition to cannons. The aircraft's rugged construction made it well suited for low-altitude operations where it faced intense ground fire. On February 14, 1943, Tanner led an attack against Japanese positions near Donbaik. His Hurricane carried 2 250-pound bombs under the wings and full cannon ammunition. He dove through moderate anti-aircraft fire, released ordnance on target, then strafed trenches before climbing away. The Hurricane absorbed multiple hits from ground fire, small caliber rounds that penetrated fabric surfaces but missed critical systems. Tanner felt the impacts through the airframe, but the aircraft continued flying. He returned to base, with 17 holes counted by ground crew. "She took it and kept going," Stan observed, examining the damage. This became the Hurricane's new identity, not the fastest or most glamorous fighter, but the one that could absorb punishment and complete ground attack missions, too dangerous for lighter aircraft. Squadron records from 1943 show Hurricanes flying thousands of ground attack sorties, supporting British and Indian Army operations across the Burma front. Loss rates to ground fire were significant, but mission completion rates were high. A tactical assessment from Southeast Asia Command noted, Hurricane's structural durability proves advantageous in close air support role, aircraft capable of sustaining battle damage and returning to base more consistently than lighter types. Tanner flew through 1943 and into early 1944, accumulating mission tallies that would have seemed impossible in the desperate days of 1941. The Hurricane evolved with the campaign, adapting to each new role as circumstances demanded. By mid-1944, as newer aircraft types became available in larger numbers, Hurricanes began their gradual withdrawal from frontline service. But their contribution to holding the line during the darkest period was documented and undeniable. As the war in Burma reached its conclusion in 1945, Tanner found himself at a transit camp in Calcutta, waiting for transport home. The fighting continued, but his squadron had been disbanded, its Hurricanes retired, its personnel reassigned or demobilized. He sat on a wooden bench outside the camp headquarters, looking across the maintenance yards where a few Hurricane airframes remained, awaiting scrapping or conversion to training duties. The aircraft that had been mocked for being slow and obsolete had survived 4 years of brutal combat. Tanner reflected on the mechanics like Stan, who had kept the Hurricanes flying through impossible conditions. He thought about wingmen who hadn't returned, their names recorded in squadron ledgers but lost to the jungle or sea. The Hurricane's combat record in Southeast Asia was now documented. Official tallies showed thousands of sorties flown, hundreds of enemy aircraft claimed, and countless ground attack missions completed. The statistics told one story: mission success rates, exchange ratios, serviceability percentages. But Tanner knew another story. He knew how the Hurricane felt in his hands during a dive attack, how the cannons hammered when they fired, how the engine note changed when pushed to emergency power. He knew the smell of coolant and gunpowder in the cockpit, the vibration of bullet impacts, the relief of wheels touching down after a damaged return. A declassified Air Ministry report from 1946 assessed the Hurricane's Pacific service. While not ideal for the theatre, the Hurricane performed adequately when employed within its limitations. The aircraft's durability and firepower proved valuable assets. Pilot and ground crew adaptation largely determined operational success. That final sentence captured something important. The Hurricane hadn't won through technical superiority. It had won through the skill, determination, and improvisation of the people who flew and maintained it. Tanner boarded a transport ship in March 1945, carrying few possessions but many memories. The Hurricane had brought him through. Not perfectly, not easily, but it had brought him through. The final mission tallies appeared in Air Ministry records compiled after the war. Hurricane squadrons in the Burma theatre flew approximately 12,000 combat sorties between December 1941 and January 1945. They claimed 550 enemy aircraft destroyed, with additional probables and damaged. Loss rates averaged 3.2% per sortie during the height of operations in 1942, declining to 1.8% by 1944 as tactics improved. But Tanner understood the real victory wasn't in those numbers. It was in the work done on muddy airstrips by mechanics like Stan, who kept outdated aircraft operational through skill and determination. It was in the tactical adaptation that turned disadvantages into workable strategies. It was in the persistence that refused to accept defeat when circumstances seemed impossible. The Hurricane had never been the best fighter in any theatre where it served, but it had been good enough, and good enough sustained operations until better equipment arrived. That unglamorous contribution, being adequate when nothing else was available, had strategic value that transcended performance specifications. A letter from Stan, written years after the war, reflected on his service. "We worked on Hurricanes because that's what we had. The aircraft had faults, certainly, but she was built honest, and she could take punishment. You learned to respect that." The Hurricane's legacy in the Pacific and Burma theatres was precisely that respect, earned not through superiority, but through reliability, durability, and the capacity to function when circumstances were hostile and alternatives absent. In the end, it wasn't about the fighter. It was about the people who made it relevant despite its limitations. The pilots who learned its language, the mechanics who kept it flying, the commanders who employed it properly. The collective effort that transformed a machine with significant disadvantages into a weapon system that held the line during critical years. The records show what was achieved. The archives preserve how it was done. The Hurricane's contribution endures in both.